Dan Kaminsky is the Director of Penetration Testing at IO Active, where he focuses on design capabilities and vulnerabilities of network protocols. He is probably most famous for having discovered a fundamental flaw in the domain name system, or DNS, that would have allowed him to reassign web addresses, take over banking sites, or disrupt the flow of data over the internet. Thankfully, he was a good hacker and brought this flaw to the attention of those entities that were in a position to fix it. Dan Kaminsky, you are our first witness. You're recognized for 5 minutes. I know you've presented some testimony already, so feel free to summarize as you see as appropriate.
Hello, everyone. Members of the subcommittee, please allow me to express my appreciation for offering me this opportunity to testify today. I am, as said, the Director of Penetration Testing at IO Active. I've spent the last 10 years of my career working with Fortune 500 companies, including Cisco, Avaya, and Microsoft, to help secure their systems. It was an interesting experience fixing DNS, working with all of the people that needed to be in a position to actually get the fix out, get the fix deployed, and ultimately protect the ecosystem. It was an example of a public-private partnership. We worked with U.S. CERT in order to get communication out to the federal agencies that themselves had to get software out. And it was a remarkable experience for all parties. It was a highlight of 2008. 2008 was not, however, an easy year. Verizon Business actually every year puts out a report called the Data Breach Investigation Report. In an industry that always struggles to have good data to work with, Verizon actually did a wonderful thing, and has for the last few years, in summarizing what they see in their limited sample of their customer base. And what they saw was astonishing. Over 285 million records were compromised last year, just from their customer base. According to Verizon, this is more than every other year they'd seen combined. Worse, over 91% of those compromised records, most of which were payment card information, over 91% of those were traced going back to organized crime. We have worldwide problems, and we live in a much more dangerous world than when I first started doing computer security years ago. The reality is, hacking is no longer about kids. It's about people with kids who would like to feed them. Attackers have had years to figure out the absolute best ways that they can monetize their access. Recently, they actually managed to coordinate a widespread attack against the ATM infrastructure, in which in 49 cities, $9 million was extracted from ATMs using purloined ATM data. Beyond that, extortion, something we have almost no information on, is rumored to be becoming an extraordinary problem, not merely hitting the sides or the gambling or pornography aspects of the economy, but actually standard businesses. As you mentioned, Conficker, it turns out, was a remarkable success. If Conficker had come out in 2003, pretty much every single computer on the internet, at least every Windows machine, would have been compromised. Since 2003, Windows has become a much more secure platform. The actual result of the work from 2003 was probably over 99% of the machines that otherwise would have been infected by Conficker never had a problem. That's what happened that is the results from our scans and our monitoring of the situation. That being said, a percentage of a large number is still a large number, and we have had to deal with millions and millions of machines infected. What was most scary about Conficker is, thus far, we still have no idea what the authors of it want. So where do most of these compromises come from? How is this happening? A lot of problems are in software. This is true. There's a lot of buggy software out there. But according to the Verizon Business Report, over 60% of actual penetrations that led to loss of data did not come from buggy code. They came from our simple inability to strongly authenticate other nodes on the internet. Default passwords, lack of insufficiently strong passwords. It turns out authentication is in huge amounts of trouble on the internet today, and the data suggests it is leading directly to compromises of personal information. Now people may say, why are we still using passwords? Why is this problem still there? It turns out because it's the only way to reasonably make things work at all. Turns out if something doesn't work, people won't use it, even if it is theoretically more secure. This is ultimately why I've become a supporter of the technology known as DNSSEC. DNSSEC, on its face, is a method to fix DNS. But it's not just that. DNSSEC ultimately allows us to use DNS's power for allowing communication across organizational lines, ultimately trust across organizational lines, and allows us to apply cryptographic strength to that trust so it can be used not just for existing systems, or not just for locating systems, but for actually authenticating them, and ultimately authenticating the people on the other side. It will take some work, it will take a lot of work, but I see it as the key towards making a new security authenticating ecosystem. Thank you.
Our next witness is Rodney Jaffe, is the Senior Vice President and Senior Technologist for Neustar. He's a renowned expert on security flaws in the Internet. He also participated in the Department of Homeland Security Cyberstorm 2, a multinational cybersecurity exercise that examines security preparedness and response capabilities across a variety of infrastructure. Mr. Jaffe, you're recognized for 5 minutes. You just turn on your microphone and pull it towards you.
I'm the, as you said, the Senior Vice President and Senior Technologist for Neustar. Neustar provides innovative services that enable trusted communication across networks, applications, enterprises around the world. A major portion of that is involvement with directories. I joined Neustar in 2006 when UltraDNS, which was a company that I founded, was acquired by Neustar. DNS is the core directory that really routes traffic on the Internet. Every one of us uses it all the time. Any computing machine makes use of DNS. The technology itself basically deals with the fact that as humans, we recognize we're able to use words. Computers understand numbers, in this particular case IP addresses, and they require the IP addresses to be able to move traffic or to be able to get you from one site to another. The DNS, simply put, is the directory that converts names to numbers and vice versa. So for example, if I want to go to www.house.gov, I'd put that into an internet browser, and the DNS would convert that to the IP address 204.141.87.18, and the computing device is then able to get you to the house server, and the screen appears on your computer. So Neustar also provides the core directory service for the .biz and the .us top-level domains, as well as 17 other top-level domains, including a number of other country codes. So for example, we provide the service for Canada.ca, for the United Kingdom, and for Japan. We also provided the directory service for anyone attempting to reach many of the Fortune 500 or the E2000 sites. So in all, we serve about 4,000 corporations and government departments around the world, and about 15 million domain names. I really appreciate you inviting me to speak about the particular threats, and I appreciate the fact that the committee has actually taken an interest. Probably the oldest reason for internet attacks is that of ego or bragging. There are three real reasons. The perpetrators behind those kinds of attacks are generally young and immature, and they're intent on showing the prowess with computer programming, with little or no regard for the damage that they cause in their attacks. The second, the most common category, is for financial gain. In this case, the attacks are committed by individuals as well as organized gangs of criminals. They include large spam email that you'd mentioned, the interception and illegal use of computer data, which you'd also mentioned, most commonly bank data and credit card data, extortion schemes, which have been around for quite a while, and distributed denial of service attacks. In DDoS, or distributed denial of service attacks, botnets, which are large groups of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of machines, all working together that have been previously infected, will be used and rented by criminals in the underground, not only for themselves, but they rent them out. It's business. The criminal then commands the botnet to try and reach a specific site. The result is that a website, for example, is hit by millions of packets at the same time. in an attempt to overwhelm the site and take it down. Frequently, it's successful. An important thing to note here is that it would require fewer than 10,000 strategically located compromised machines with some reasonable knowledge to disable a sizable portion of the US internet. Doesn't take many machines. Generally, though, the botnets involve hundreds of thousands because the people who build these botnets have no real cost. They're using our resources, and botnets are built almost automatically. In fact, we've seen notes where kids go off to school, come back from school, and have a look at how many bots they've added to their botnet while they've been at school. We've actually seen discussion in the underground about that. Another lesser known but very dangerous kind of malicious behavior exists in cyberspace, which is known as DNS cache poisoning. This is something that Dan had discovered, as you know, last year. Thanks to Dan, we're a lot safer than we were. But effectively what happens with DNS cache poisoning is that your ISPs, caching servers, are poisoned. The DNS is pointed to a fake site. When you go to your bank, you end up at a website that looks just like your bank, but actually isn't. It belongs to criminals. And what they do is they ask you for your password, ask for your user ID, and then they go ahead and make use of that to make transfers and to empty your account. The third category to talk about is cyber terrorism, which really relates to generally nation-state issues. Over the last 2 years, there have been at least 3 public attacks, reportedly nation-state. We know that one of them probably is. Countries you will recognize, Estonia, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan. And additionally, the Wall Street Journal reported on April 8th of this year that, as you had mentioned, critical infrastructure facilities had been compromised. It's really important to note over here that while most people are unaware of the attacks, these attacks are going on all the time, and our industry is reasonably successful in being able to actually stop some of those attacks before they become public. But the attacks are occurring all of the time. On April 12th, talking about banking stuff, most of this is theoretical. On April 12th, the DNS servers of a major Brazilian ISP, Virtua, were compromised. Their cache was poisoned for the entry of one of the largest banks in Brazil, Bradesco, making use of the kinds of things that Dan had talked about. Users of that bank were redirected to a fake website, and it took about 5 hours before the bank and the ISP were able to realize that, in fact, the entry had been poisoned. The bank was reasonably open in their statement when they said approximately 1% of our customers were affected by this. But that represents almost 150,000 individuals who could possibly have had their accounts compromised during one event. And this is an event in one country over the course of 5 hours. The other event is one that you touched on already, and with your indulgence, I'll perhaps expand a bit more, which is on the Conficker botnet, the Conficker worm. We have an industry group called the Conficker Working Group, an unofficial group that came together in the private sector to deal with a real threat, an immediate threat of Conficker. They've been working around the clock to dismantle the botnet with no real success. On the 8th of April, as you said, it took its first steps with version E. You had mentioned earlier that it upgraded from version D to version E. It wasn't just an upgrade. It was also the first time that we got some insight into how the botnet was actually going to be used. It was used to sell fake antivirus. If you've seen those pop-ups on your computer screen where there's a message that says that you're infected, you normally expect that to show from your antivirus software. In fact, if you're infected with Conficker, there are no messages from your antivirus software. It was actually from the criminal group behind it. They then advertised some software that you could purchase online there and then, enter your credit card information, your personal information, and download their software. Of course, their software didn't disable the virus. It installed more malicious software, and the job is now even more difficult. As a sobering side note on this, last month, in collaboration with one of the other members of the Conficker Working Group from Georgia Tech, we identified at least 300 critical medical devices from a single manufacturer. We stumbled on it. It's not that easy to tell what it is. There were at least 300 medical devices that were infected with Conficker. The hospitals had no idea. The manufacturer had no idea. When we called them, they were obviously shocked. These devices are used in hospitals to allow doctors to view high-intensity scans, MRI, for example, CT scans. and they're often found in or near ICU facilities. They're connected to local area networks. They should never, ever have been connected to the internet, and according to the manufacturers, they weren't. However, they were connected at some stage to the internet because they were infected, and they were checking in with us. The way that we know they're infected is that we run systems that those devices will connect to. Worse, after we'd notified the manufacturer and the hospitals involved, and we're obviously doing our best, the hospitals around the world, we were told that because of FDA rules that they refer to as 510K regulations, 90 days notice was required before the systems could be modified to remove the infections and the vulnerabilities. In some cases, clearly, there can be a disconnect between government rules, which are meant to protect consumers, and today's cyber threats, which sometimes result in delaying and hindering the ability to fix problems, as in the medical system. So based on my long experience in operating large networks connected to the internet, I think one of the most important areas for Congress to concentrate on is improving the communication both between the public and the private sectors and across those sectors. The Department of Homeland Security operates U.S. CERT, which as part of its mission acts as a liaison between the public and private sectors. It's a start, but in my view, it's woefully understaffed and it's woefully underfunded for the enormous task that's put before it. Ideally, I'd like to see much more focused collaboration, something that Dan had mentioned and I assume that you've heard before. In summary, we face enormous escalating threats from all parts of cyberspace, both to the economy and to the safety and well-being of our citizens. So beyond the normal perennial call for additional resources, we need to concentrate on improving the collaboration between industry and government, between different government departments, and between the U.S. and foreign governments. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to address you and the rest of the committee, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chaffee. Our next witness is Larry Clinton. He's the President and CEO of the Internet Security Alliance, an organization that represents corporate security interests and provides a forum for information sharing on information security issues. Mr. Clinton is also a member of the GAO's experts panel, which will make recommendations to the Obama administration on cybersecurity. Mr. Clinton, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for inviting us to have this hearing, and we are delighted to participate. Mr. Chairman, virtually our entire economy, our defense system, our culture now depend on electronic communication systems that are extremely vulnerable and under constant attack. The vast majority of these systems are owned and operated by the private sector. Unfortunately, virtually all the economic incentives regarding cybersecurity favor the attackers. Attacks are relatively cheap. The area to defend is virtually limitless. Defense, residing in thousands of separate, although connected systems, is difficult to coordinate and expensive compared to the return on investment. The good news is that we know a great deal about how to prevent and stop these attacks. The bad news is we're just not doing it. The PricewaterhouseCoopers Global Information Security Study of over 1,000 companies found that those that followed the industry best practices could prevent, almost entirely mitigate, the attacks against them. The 2008 Data Breach Investigations Report, previously referred to, studied more than 500 forensic engagements over a 4-year period and concluded that 87% of the breaches could have been avoided if reasonable and identifiable security practices had been followed. Robert Bigman, Chief of Information Assurance for the CIA, has stated publicly that most of the attacks that he sees are not that sophisticated, and 80 to 90% of them could be prevented with due diligence. However, we cannot solve cybersecurity problems by attempting to adapt 19th century models to a 21st century problem. A common theme from some policymakers who are relatively new to the cybersecurity problem tend to say, well, if industry won't do this on their own, we'll just have to regulate them. The Internet Security Alliance believes that such an approach is short-sighted and does not reflect the necessary understanding of the new breed of technologies and created by the Internet. To begin with, federal regulatory mandates are best designed to combat corporate malfeasance, and that's not the problem we're facing with Internet security. Even if Congress were to enact an enlightened statute, it would only have reach to our national borders, and this is an international problem. A set of U.S. regulations would put U.S. industry at a competitive disadvantage in the global marketplace at a time we can least afford it. Specific regulations would likely be too static to the technology, and the threat vectors constantly change, while flexible or conceptual regulations may be too general to have any real effect. Regulations are often subject to political pressure, making minimum standards de facto ceilings, something like what we have with campaign finance. We need a better system, a 21st century system. Fortunately, there are signs that the Obama administration understands the need for a modern approach to cybersecurity that appreciates the economic issues as much as the technical ones. President Obama assigned Melissa Hathaway of the National Security Council to conduct a review of our nation's cybersecurity status. While the report has not been made fully public, Ms. Hathaway did provide a preview a week ago in Silicon Valley. Among the specifics from the report that she did share was acceptance of the principle that, quote, previous attempts to deal with cybersecurity in isolation have failed in no small part because cybersecurity only succeeds in the context of broader economic progress. In particular, Ms. Hathaway specifically cited the need for government to work with the private sector to, quote, improve market incentives. This is a significant departure from the previous administration's view, which was that the market would emerge spontaneously to address these problems. That did not happen. Ms. Hathaway is correct. We need to improve market incentives. Consistent with this view, the Internet Security Alliance asks Congress to consider enacting what we call the Cyber Safety Act. The Cyber Safety Act is an affirmative and contemporary approach to dealing with the 21st century problems of cybersecurity. In brief, we suggest that government's role is not to prescribe mandatory regulation, but rather provide market incentives for the private sector entities to adopt the security practices and standards and technologies that have already been empirically demonstrated to work. There are a wide range of incentives which have already been used in various sectors of the economy, such as insurance, liability protections, procurement, awards programs, SBA loans, etc. All these achieve government goals. What we're suggesting is that these should now be applied to cybersecurity. Government ought to designate a range of public and private sector entities which can serve as a qualifying set for standards and practices. Government ought to then fund research used to evaluate the standards, practices, and technologies developed on an ongoing basis with the sole criteria being their effectiveness. Private sector entities that can demonstrate compliance with the standards and practices would be deemed effective and would qualify for the incentives. What we're attempting to do here through the Cyber Safety Act is to change the economics of cybersecurity by constructing a market that makes private organizations want to continually invest in cybersecurity in their own economic self-interest. Only then can we create the sort of sustainable and evolving system of cybersecurity that we need. The purpose of this system is to defend the national security's interest, and thus it is worth the relatively modest investment that the government would have to make in order to provide the incentives. The present research and the expert testimony shows that by motivating the widespread adoption of the practices that have already been demonstrated to work, the vast majority of the problem we're experiencing can be quickly addressed. However, there is a small but critical 10 to 15% of attacks that will not be addressed in this fashion. My written statement goes into some detail on a number of these problems, including the supply chain, the incongruity with laws that were written in the 1980s to current technology, the need to change the basis for security from protecting the instruments like the computers to protecting the data itself. All of these will require a lot more work than what we're proposing with the Cyber and Safety Act. We look forward to working with the committee both to address the 90% of the problem that's basically low-hanging fruit, as well as the 10% of the problem that's going to require substantial more work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Clinton. Our final panelist before we begin questions is Gregory Nojim. He is a senior counsel and director of the Project on Freedom, Security, and Technology at the Center for Democracy and Technology. He's been integral in bringing together broad coalitions from across the political spectrum to limit the threats to privacy and civil liberties posed by government monitoring of the Internet and other communications. Mr. Nojim, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Weiner. It's really a pleasure to testify today on behalf of CDT. Our organization is a nonprofit organization, and we're dedicated to keeping the Internet open, innovative, and free. So it won't surprise you that most of my comments today will focus on the communications infrastructure as opposed to other infrastructure systems, and in particular on the Internet. Cybersecurity policy should distinguish between government systems and systems that are owned and operated by the private sector. Policy toward government systems can be much more prescriptive. It can be much more top-down than policy toward private systems. Congress should also distinguish between the elements of the critical infrastructure operated by the private sector that primarily support free speech and those that do not. And as an example, measures that might be appropriate for securing the control systems of a pipeline, they might not be right for securing the internet. It might be wise, for example, to require a particular kind of authentication of a user of an information system that controls a pipeline. But it might not be wise to require that same kind of authentication for a computer user in the privacy of their own home while they're surfing the internet. The characteristics that have made the internet successful, openness, decentralization, user control, things that you mentioned in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, these things can be put at risk if heavy-handed cybersecurity policies are applied to all critical infrastructure. This subcommittee should make protection of these attributes an essential part of its cybersecurity mission. It is also important to ensure that cybersecurity measures do not result in a governmental entity monitoring private communications networks for intrusions. Monitoring these systems is the job of private sector communications providers, and they already do this. The government can help them do a better job. It can help them develop tools that allow communications providers to monitor for intrusions in the least intrusive way. But it should not be in the business of monitoring private networks itself. Nor should the government be in the business of shutting down internet traffic to compromised critical infrastructure information systems in the private sector. While some have proposed giving the President this extraordinary power over all critical infrastructures, we believe it should extend only to governmental systems. Such authority applied to private systems would empower a president to coerce unwise, even illegal activity. To our knowledge, no circumstance has yet arisen that would justify a presidential order to cut off internet traffic to a private critical infrastructure system when the operators of that system think it should not be cut off. We also urge you to carefully address two overarching, recurring cybersecurity policy problems. The first, excessive secrecy. The subcommittee should work to improve the transparency of the cybersecurity program. Transparency builds trust with the private sector, and that is essential to foster its cooperation. It also enhances public understanding of the nature and justification for any impact on users of cybersecurity measures. Transparency also promotes essential accountability. The second overarching problem is improving information sharing between the private sector and the government. Starting with the right questions about information sharing will help in settling on the right answers. Exactly what information held by the private sector has not been shared with the government when it was specifically requested? What reasons were given for the decision not to share? Why are existing information sharing structures like U.S. CERT falling short? And what additional market incentives would encourage the private sector to share threat and incident information solutions? Generally, as you approach these and other cybersecurity problems, we urge you to favor market-based measures over mandates. And we ask that you consider carefully the impact on the Internet of measures proposed for securing all critical infrastructure systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much.